The morning mist rose off Carter like the same way it had every summer since I was 8 years old. Standing at my kitchen window with coffee in hand, I watched the water shimmer gold in the early light. This view belonged to my family for 47 years before a single house appeared on the surrounding hills. My grandfather bought this land in 1978, 5 acres of waterfront paradise that became my childhood refuge and eventually my inheritance. The envelope in my mailbox shattered that peace. Thick cream paper with an embossed red seal. Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association. My stomach dropped before I even opened it. I've been getting minor violation notices for months now. Grass too tall by 1 inch. Mailbox 11 inches too short. Shutters the wrong shade of green despite being the original color my grandfather chose in 1985. Each notice carried the same theatrical signature. Lillian Strickland, HOA President, her name sprawling across 3 lines like she was signing the Declaration of Independence. This one was different. Notice of violation screamed across the top in bold capitals. My eyes scanned the typed paragraphs, each word tightening the knot in my chest. Apparently, I was violating HOA regulations by using an unauthorized footpath to access the lake instead of the designated community access point half a mile down the shore. The fine was $500, payable within 14 days. Continued violation would result in appropriate legal action. I stood there listening to cicadas hum in the oak trees my grandfather planted, holding a letter that tried to erase 47 years of history with a single threat. The footpath they mentioned was the same worn trail I'd walked thousands of times as a kid, the one my grandfather cleared when he first bought the property, long before any HOA existed. 2 generations had walked it before these houses appeared. Now someone wanted to charge me $500 for stepping on my own land. Working as a document conservator taught me to respect provenance, the chain of ownership proving something is real. I spent my days restoring centuries-old manuscripts, verifying signatures, cross-referencing dates. When someone makes claims about ownership or rights, my first instinct isn't anger. It's to check the paperwork. So instead of calling Lillian Strickland and shouting into the phone like she probably expected, I walked back inside and went straight to the fireproof filing cabinet in my study. The deed sat exactly where I'd filed it after the estate settled, preserved in an acid-free archival sleeve. The paper had yellowed slightly around the edges, but the text remained perfectly legible. 5 acres, waterfront access included, purchased by Richard Brennan, June 12, 1978. My grandfather's signature at the bottom, witnessed and notarized. I pulled out the cadastral survey map next, showing precise property boundaries. The footpath Lillian claimed was unauthorized ran entirely within my property lines, not even close to the edge. From outside came the faint hum of the small electrical substation behind my house. That steady, almost hypnotic buzz had been the soundtrack of my childhood summers. My grandfather used to say it was the heartbeat of the neighborhood, though at the time I'd been too young to understand what he meant. The HOA formed in 2010 when a developer bought surrounding parcels and built 45 identical houses in neat rows. My grandfather refused to sell, even when they offered 3 times the land's value. When I inherited the property in 2017, I kept his philosophy intact. The developer worked around me, and the HOA charter was drawn up without input from the one family who'd actually been here first. Lillian Strickland took over as president 2 years ago. Before that, the HOA had been mostly invisible, handling snow removal and maintaining the community center. But Lillian treated the position like she was governing a small nation. This wasn't about mailbox height or grass length anymore. This was about someone trying to erase history because it didn't fit neatly into their color-coded spreadsheet of community regulations. I picked up my phone and scrolled to Diana Porter's number. We'd gone to college together. She ended up in real estate law while I ended up restoring damaged manuscripts in climate-controlled archives. but she was excellent at what she did. And more importantly, she understood that sometimes the law was about respecting what came before. She answered on the second ring. I explained the situation in under a minute. Lillian Strickland, she said with something like resignation in her voice, then told me to come by that afternoon with everything I had. Diana Porter's office smelled like fresh coffee and old leather, the kind of space where serious work happened. Afternoon sunlight filtered through wooden blinds as I laid out my documents in sequence. Original deed first, then survey maps, then photographs. Diana pulled reading glasses from her desk drawer and leaned forward, tracing property lines on the cadastral map with one finger. She was quiet for a long time, cross-referencing the deed against the survey, checking dates, verifying signatures. When she finally looked up, satisfaction flickered in her expression. "This is clean," she said, tapping the survey map. "Your property line extends 15 feet past where that footpath runs. The HOA doesn't have any legal basis to restrict your access." She flipped to the HOA violation notice, reading more carefully now. They're citing community regulations drafted in 2010, but those regulations can't supersede property rights established 3 decades earlier. It's like trying to pass a law today that makes something you did legally in 1990 suddenly illegal. Doesn't work that way. Relief I hadn't realized I was carrying eased from my shoulders. So they can't enforce the fine. Diana shook her head. Not legally, no, but that doesn't mean they won't try to make your life difficult. Lillian Strickland has a reputation. She doesn't back down easily, especially when someone challenges her authority. I've had 3 other clients in Lakeside Meadows contact me this year about her overreach. Were they in the wrong legally? I asked. Diana made a so-so gesture. Depends on how you read the HOA charter. Some of it's enforceable, some of it's aspirational at best. The problem is most people don't know the difference. Lillian banks on that ignorance. She uses the threat of legal action to keep people in line, but she rarely follows through because her position isn't as strong as she pretends. She leaned back in her chair. With you, though, she picked the wrong fight. Your property predates the HOA. You're not even technically bound by their charter unless you voluntarily agreed to join, which I'm guessing you didn't. My grandfather refused to sign anything when the development went in. He thought HOAs were bureaucratic nonsense. Diana smiled. Smart man. All right, here's what we do. I'll draft a formal response to their violation notice. We'll cite the deed, include copies of the survey, reference relevant property law statutes. The tone will be professional but firm. Essentially, we're telling them to back off because they have no legal standing. We'll send it certified mail with proof of delivery and CC the entire HOA board, not just Lillian. Sometimes having witnesses to her overreach makes her think twice. What if she escalates anyway? Diana's expression turned serious. Then we file a harassment complaint with the county and potentially pursue a restraining order if she continues interfering with your property rights. But honestly, Holden, I think once she sees the documentation, she'll realize she can't win this. People like Lillian rely on intimidation, not actual legal authority. When you call their bluff with evidence, they usually fold. I wanted to believe that, but something about the aggressive flourish of Lillian's signature made me think she wasn't the type to fold easily. After leaving Diana's office, I drove back to the property and walked the footpath with my phone, photographing everything. The worn dirt trail winding through tall grass. The concrete property markers my grandfather set decades ago, each stamped with a survey date. The old oak tree at the trail's entrance, its trunk wider than my arms could reach. I documented everything methodically, leaving no room for ambiguity. Each photograph was time-stamped and geotagged. On my way back, I stopped at Vincent Murray's place. He was 73 now, one of the few neighbors who remembered the area before the development. He was in his garage when I knocked, tinkering with an old fishing reel. When I explained what the HOA was trying to do, his face darkened. "That's ridiculous," he said. "I've been here since '82. Your grandfather's trail was already worn down by then. He used to invite the whole neighborhood down to fish off his dock. Lillian's rewriting history to suit her agenda." "Would you be willing to write that down?" I asked. "Sign and date it. I might need witness statements if this goes further." Vincent wiped his hands on a rag and nodded. "Give me something to write on. I'll do it right now. She's been a menace since she took over. Someone needs to stand up to her." Back at my house, I compiled everything into a single document folder: deed in the first sleeve, survey maps in the second, photographs in the third, Vincent's signed statement in the fourth. Everything labeled, dated, and arranged into a single airtight record. That evening, Diana sent over the draft response. I read it twice, admiring how she built the argument: precise, calm, and firm. The final paragraph was particularly satisfying, professional yet unmistakable in its finality. I approved the letter, and Diana promised to send it certified mail first thing in the morning. That night, I sat on my back porch with a glass of bourbon, looking toward the lake. The sun was setting, painting the water gold and orange. From behind the house came the steady hum of the substation, that familiar electrical buzz that had been part of the soundtrack here for as long as I could remember. I thought about my grandfather's words from years ago. Just because something serves the community doesn't mean the community owns it. Tomorrow, Lillian would get the letter. After that, we'd see exactly how far she was willing to push. 3 days passed with silence that felt heavier than any response. Diana confirmed Lillian's sign for the certified letter on Wednesday morning at 9:47. By Thursday afternoon, I expected some reaction, maybe a terse email, perhaps a phone call from HOA legal counsel admitting their mistake. Instead, I got escalation. The first sign came Thursday evening when I found a printed flyer taped to my mailbox. Bold red letters across the top read "Community Notice," followed by several paragraphs about a problematic property owner who was refusing to comply with reasonable neighborhood standards and creating discord through frivolous legal threats. My name wasn't mentioned, but the reference to waterfront access made it obvious. The flyer had been distributed to every mailbox in Lakeside Meadows. I stood there reading it 3 times, feeling anger build in my chest. This wasn't just doubling down, this was character assassination. Lillian was trying to turn the neighborhood against me before anyone could see the actual facts. My phone rang. Vincent Murray. "Did you see this garbage?" he said without preamble. "I've got neighbors asking me if you're really causing problems. I'm setting them straight, but Holden, she's poisoning the well. People believe what they read, especially when it comes from someone with authority." I thanked Vincent and hung up, then immediately called Diana. "I saw it," she said before I could speak. "Someone forwarded me a photo an hour ago. It's defamation, plain and simple. She's making false statements that damage your reputation. We can add this to the harassment complaint." "How fast can we file?" "I'll have it ready by tomorrow morning. But Holden, I need to warn you, Lillian's playing a different game now. She's not trying to win legally anymore. She's trying to make your life so miserable that you give up and pay the fine just to make it stop. That's her pattern. Intimidation through social pressure." Friday morning brought another development. I found a second notice taped to my front door, this one from the HOA board announcing an emergency community meeting, scheduled for Sunday afternoon to address concerns about property disputes and neighborhood harmony. The meeting agenda specifically mentioned reviewing policies regarding non-compliant homeowners. I wasn't invited to speak, I was the subject. Diana's voice was tight with controlled fury when I forwarded her the notice. "They're holding a tribunal without giving you a chance to defend yourself. That's not just unfair, it's potentially actionable. I'm filing the harassment complaint today, and I'm also sending a cease and desist letter to every board member. If they proceed with that meeting without allowing you equal time to present your evidence, we'll have grounds for a lawsuit." Saturday afternoon, my neighbor 2 houses down, a woman named Rebecca Chen I'd always had pleasant conversations with, crossed the street when she saw me checking my mail. "Holden, I'm sorry to bother you," she said, genuine discomfort in her expression. "But people are asking questions, and I thought you should know what's being said." "I appreciate that, Rebecca. What are you hearing?" She glanced around like someone might be listening. "Lillian's telling people you're trying to privatize lake access that belongs to everyone. She's saying you're being selfish and litigious, that you hired an aggressive lawyer to bully the HOA. Some people are saying you should just pay the fine and stop causing drama." My jaw tightened. Did she mention that the path runs entirely on my property, that it existed 30 years before the HOA, that my family's been here since '78? Rebecca shook her head. "She didn't mention any of that. She's making it sound like you moved in recently and immediately started causing problems." I pulled out my phone and showed Rebecca the deed, the survey map, the timeline Diana had prepared. Her eyes widened as she scrolled through the documents. "This changes everything," she said quietly. "Why isn't anyone else seeing this?" "Because Lillian's controlling the narrative, but that changes tomorrow at the meeting." Rebecca squeezed my arm. "I'll be there, and I'll make sure my husband comes too. You shouldn't have to face this alone." That evening I prepared a presentation. If Lillian wanted a public confrontation, she'd get one, but on terms she hadn't anticipated. I printed copies of every document, the deed, both survey maps, photographs of the property markers, Vincent's witness statement, Diana's legal analysis. 45 copies, one for every household. I also prepared a timeline showing exactly what happened and when, the violation notice, my documented response, the defamatory flyer, the emergency meeting scheduled without my input, everything laid out in clear, undeniable sequence. Diana called that evening with an update. "The harassment complaint is filed. The cease and desist letters were delivered by courier at 4 this afternoon. Lillian's attorney responded an hour ago saying the emergency meeting would proceed as scheduled, but you'd be given time to speak. It's not ideal, but it's progress." "I'm ready," I said. "I've got documentation for everyone." "Good. Remember, stay calm, stick to facts, don't let her provoke an emotional response. You have the law on your side. Let the evidence speak for itself." Sunday morning arrived with humidity that made the air feel like soup. I dressed carefully, khakis and a button-down shirt, professional but not formal. I wanted to look like what I was, a reasonable person forced to defend himself against unreasonable attacks. The community center's parking lot was packed when I arrived 15 minutes early. Clearly, Lillian had succeeded in drawing a crowd. I carried my box of documentation inside and found a seat in the back row next to Vincent and Rebecca. Lillian sat at the front table with 4 other board members, all looking uncomfortable except her. She wore a navy blazer and pearl necklace, dressed like she was presiding over a corporate boardroom rather than a neighborhood meeting. When she saw me walk in with my box of papers, something flickered in her expression. Not quite fear, but recognition that I wasn't going to roll over quietly. The meeting was about to begin, and I had 45 copies of the truth ready to distribute. Whatever happened next, everyone would see exactly who was telling the truth and who was abusing power they never actually had. Lillian called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel against the table. The community center fell silent, 40-some residents packed into folding chairs, the air conditioning struggling against the afternoon heat. "Thank you all for coming," Lillian began, her voice carrying false warmth. "We're here to address a situation that's been causing unnecessary conflict in our community. Recent actions by one property owner have raised concerns about respect for neighborhood standards and the authority of this board to maintain harmony." She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. The HOA exists to protect property values and ensure everyone follows reasonable guidelines, she continued. When someone decides those rules don't apply to them, when they hire lawyers to threaten legal action over minor compliance issues, it affects all of us. Today, we'll review our policies and discuss appropriate responses to such behavior. I felt Rebecca tense beside me. Vincent muttered something under his breath. Lillian spent the next 10 minutes painting a picture of a troublesome newcomer disrupting an otherwise peaceful neighborhood. She referenced unauthorized path usage, refusal to cooperate, and aggressive legal threats, without once mentioning that the path ran on my property or that I'd owned the land for decades. Several residents nodded along, already convinced by the flyers they'd received. Finally, she gestured toward me. Mr. Brennan has requested time to speak. We'll allow 5 minutes for his response, after which the board will vote on enhanced enforcement measures. 5 minutes. She'd taken 10 to poison the room against me, and I got 5 to defend myself. I stood and walked to the front, setting my box of documents on the table. Diana had advised staying calm, sticking to facts. I intended to do exactly that. "Thank you for the time," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'm going to distribute documentation to everyone here because I think it's important you see the actual facts rather than rely on second-hand summaries." I began handing out the packets I'd prepared. Lillian's face tightened as residents started flipping through pages. "The path Miss Strickland calls unauthorized is the same trail my grandfather cleared in 1978 when he bought this land," I said as I moved through the rows. 32 years before the HOA existed. That deed is in your packet, along with survey maps showing the path runs entirely within my property boundaries. A woman in the third row looked up from her packet, confusion on her face. "Wait, you own the land the path is on?" "All of it," I confirmed. 5 acres, waterfront access included. My family's been here 47 years. The HOA was formed in 2010. Property law is clear. You can't retroactively claim authority over land that predates your existence. Murmurs rippled through the room. I saw several people turning to the survey maps, tracing property lines with their fingers. Lillian stood abruptly. "That's not the issue. The issue is compliance with community standards that everyone else follows. Ms. Strickland, with respect, your authority only extends to properties that voluntarily join the HOA," I said. "My grandfather refused to sign the charter. I never signed it either. You have no legal jurisdiction over my land, which is why the violation notice you sent was invalid from the start." I turned back to the residents. "The packet also includes a flyer that was distributed Thursday evening. You may have received one. It calls me a problematic property owner who's creating discord through frivolous legal threats. What it doesn't mention is that my lawyer's response simply cited property law and asked the HOA to cease interfering with rights that have existed for nearly 5 decades. Rebecca stood. "Lillian, is it true his property predates the HOA?" Lillian's jaw tightened. "Legal technicalities don't override the need for community cooperation." "That's not a legal technicality," interrupted Martin Hayes, a retired attorney who lived on Maple Drive. "That's fundamental property law. If his deed predates your charter, you don't have standing. Period." The room erupted. Multiple conversations started at once. I saw residents comparing the survey maps to the violation notice, pointing at dates, shaking their heads. "This isn't about law," Lillian said, voice rising. "This is about being a good neighbor, about respecting the community you live in." "Then why did you defame me in writing?" I asked calmly. "Why hold this meeting without mentioning any of these facts? If this was really about neighborly cooperation, wouldn't you have started by acknowledging you made a mistake?" Lillian's face flushed red. "We didn't make a mistake. You're exploiting a loophole to avoid reasonable accountability." "It's not a loophole," Martin Hayes said firmly. It's ownership, there's a difference. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Board members were whispering frantically to each other. Residents were demanding explanations. Vincent stood and announced loudly that he'd witnessed my grandfather clear that path in the early '80s, long before any houses existed here. Through it all, Lillian stood rigid at the front table, realizing she was losing control of the narrative she'd so carefully constructed. Then my phone buzzed, a text from Diana, "Emergency, call me now." I excused myself and stepped outside into the humid afternoon. Diana answered immediately. "Holden, I just got a call from the utility company. Someone reported unauthorized modifications to the electrical substation on your property. They're sending a crew to investigate tomorrow morning." My blood went cold. I haven't touched that substation. It's been exactly the same since my grandfather's lease agreement in '95. I know, but here's the thing. The report came from the HOA, from Lillian specifically. She's claiming you're interfering with community infrastructure. I closed my eyes, pieces clicking into place. The substation. The one that powered all 45 houses in Lakeside Meadows. The one that sat on my property under a lease agreement nobody seemed to remember existed. "Diana, if the utility company investigates and finds everything in order, what happens?" "Nothing. But Holden, this feels like retaliation. She's weaponizing every system she can think of to pressure you." I thought about my grandfather's words again. Just because something serves the community doesn't mean the community owns it. "Diana, I need you to pull the lease agreement between my grandfather and the utility company. The original '95 contract. I need to know exactly what rights I have regarding that substation." There was a long pause. Why do I get the feeling you're about to do something that's going to make this situation a lot more complicated? "Not complicated," I said quietly. Clarifying. Lillian seems to think she controls infrastructure she doesn't own. Maybe it's time everyone understood exactly what that infrastructure is and who actually has authority over it. "Holden, just get me that lease agreement. I need to see what options I have." I hung up and stood there in the parking lot, listening to raised voices drift through the community center windows. Inside, people were finally seeing the truth. But Lillian wasn't backing down, she was escalating. If she wanted to weaponize infrastructure, fine. But she was about to learn that some battles reveal truths you really don't want your neighbors to know. The substation hummed behind my house, steady and constant. It had been powering this neighborhood for 30 years, sitting quietly on land everyone had forgotten belonged to someone. Tomorrow morning, the utility company would investigate and find nothing wrong. But that investigation was going to raise questions Lillian definitely didn't want answered. Questions about who really controlled the infrastructure keeping her little kingdom running. I woke Monday morning to darkness. Not the gentle pre-dawn darkness, but the wrong kind. The heavy, silent darkness that comes when electricity simply vanishes. My alarm clock was dead. The refrigerator had stopped humming. Even the small green LED on my smoke detector had gone dark. For a moment I just lay there, disoriented. Then reality hit like cold water. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand. The screen glowed bright. 6:43 in the morning, 92 degrees forecasted. I pulled on jeans and a shirt and went downstairs, already knowing what I'd find. The breaker box looked normal, every switch in the correct position. Nothing had tripped. The problem wasn't inside my house. Someone had cut the power at the source. Outside, morning air already thick with humidity made my shirt stick to my back. I walked to where the main electrical line connected. Everything looked intact. Then I headed to the fenced area behind my house where my backup generator should have been sitting on its concrete pad. The gate hung open, the lock cut clean through. The generator was gone. Only oil stains on the concrete remained, along with fresh tire tracks in the dirt. Footprints too, overlapping boot treads from at least 2 different people. They'd come in the night and taken equipment worth $3,000. I photographed everything with shaking hands. The cut lock, the empty pad, the tire tracks, the footprints, each image time-stamped. Then I found the envelope shoved through my mail slot. I knew what it would say before opening it. HOA letterhead, that pompous red seal glaring up at me. Due to continued violations and willful defiance of community standards, the board has authorized temporary suspension of utility services until compliance is achieved. Your unauthorized generator has been removed and will be returned upon payment of all outstanding fines and written commitment to cease violations. This action is supported by Section 7.3 of the HOA Charter regarding enforcement measures. Signed by Lillian, of course, with that theatrical flourish. I read it twice, forcing myself to stay calm. This wasn't just escalation. This was theft and illegal utility interference. Lillian had crossed from sending threatening letters to actually committing crimes. I called the utility company first. The representative sounded confused when I explained the situation. "Sir, according to our records, your service line is active. The power should be reaching your home. Can you send someone to investigate? There might be tampering at the connection point. We can schedule a technician, but current demand means it might be several days." I thanked her and called Diana immediately. "That's felony theft," she said, anger sharp in her voice. "The generator alone is over $1,000, which puts it in serious criminal territory. And cutting your power, that's utility interference, possibly criminal mischief. Did they actually put it in writing?" I read her the letter. There was a long pause, then something that might have been a laugh. They documented their own crime. That's almost impressive in its stupidity. "What do we do?" "File a police report immediately. Theft of the generator, criminal interference with utilities. I'll draft an emergency motion for a restraining order and file it today. And I'll send another cease and desist letter, putting them on notice that further interference will result in criminal charges and a civil lawsuit." After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table in the growing heat and thought through what came next. The police report was necessary but would take time. The restraining order might work or might just make Lillian more defensive. What I needed was leverage, something that would make her understand immediately and completely that she'd made a catastrophic mistake. I looked out the window toward the iron fence behind my house, where the substation sat humming quietly. That hum had been constant my entire life, so familiar I barely noticed it anymore. I went to the fireproof cabinet and pulled out a different folder, one I hadn't opened in years. The land lease agreement between my grandfather and the utility company, dated 1995. The document was thick and full of legal language, but the essential facts were simple. The utility company needed to expand service to accommodate the new development. They approached my grandfather about placing a small substation on his property. He agreed by leasing the land, a 99-year lease with specific terms. The company would maintain the equipment. They'd pay an annual fee. And the landowner, my grandfather, now me, retained ownership and had the right to request modifications or maintenance with appropriate notice. I'd been listed as legal contact since inheriting the property in 2017. The substation served the entire Lakeside Meadows development. 45 homes, all pulling power through infrastructure that sat on my land. I stared at that document for a long time. My grandfather's words echoed in my head. Just because something serves the community doesn't mean the community owns it. I pulled up the utility company's regional operations manager on my phone. I'd spoken to him once, 3 years ago, just to introduce myself. He'd been professional, grateful even for the cooperation. He answered after 2 rings. "This is Marcus. How can I help you?" I identified myself and explained I needed to schedule routine maintenance on the substation. There was a pause. You're listed as the landowner. Yes, I'd like to schedule a shutdown for this Saturday, 8 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon. Standard safety inspection and equipment check. Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke, there was understanding in his voice. That's a hot day forecasted. You understand that will affect service to the entire development, 45 residences. I understand. That's why I'm giving you the required 48-hour notice. I'll handle informing the residents. Everything will be properly documented, all by the book. All right, I'll need you to sign an authorization form. Landowner consent for maintenance shutdown. I can email it this afternoon. I thanked him and hung up. For a long moment, I sat there in the heat of my powerless house, thinking about what I just set in motion. 45 families would lose electricity for 9 hours on one of the hottest days of summer. Children, elderly people, anyone with medical equipment. It felt cruel. But Lillian had cut my power without hesitation. She'd stolen my property. She'd threatened me with fraudulent authority. Maybe it was time the other 44 families understood exactly what kind of person they'd empowered. Maybe it was time everyone learned that the infrastructure they took for granted didn't belong to the HOA. It belonged to someone Lillian had decided to bully. And that someone was done being patient. The authorization form arrived 2 hours later, dense, formal, but simple in essence. My signature approving scheduled maintenance shutdown of privately owned electrical infrastructure. I printed it on archival paper, signed carefully, scanned it, and emailed it back. Confirmation came within minutes. Crew scheduled for Saturday 8 a.m. will follow your lead on resident notification. That last phrase was crucial. The utility company wouldn't notify residents. That was my responsibility, which meant my message to craft. I spent an hour writing a notice that was factual yet impossible to ignore. Scheduled maintenance notice. Routine inspection of privately owned electrical substation. Saturday, July 23rd, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Power to Lakeside Meadows will be temporarily unavailable. Residents should make appropriate arrangements. Authorized by Holden Brennan, landowner. Clean, professional. Exactly what a utility company would send, except for one critical detail. The signature came from me, not the HOA. I printed 45 copies and hand-delivered them to every mailbox Tuesday evening. I also pinned one on the community center board beside Lillian's violation notices. By tomorrow morning, every resident would know who truly controlled their power. Diana called as I was finishing deliveries. I just received a very interesting email from Lillian's attorney. She's threatening to sue you for harassment and unlawful interference with HOA operations. I couldn't help but laugh. She cut my power and stole my generator, but I'm the one harassing her. I pointed that out in my reply. I also attached copies of the theft report, utility interference documentation, and our cease and desist letter. Her attorney went quiet after that. She paused. But Holden, what exactly are you planning for Saturday? I explained the maintenance shutdown, the authorization form, the resident notifications. She was quiet for a long moment. That's legal, completely within your rights as landowner. But you understand what this is going to look like. The entire neighborhood losing power on a 90-degree day right after Lillian cut yours. Is it retaliatory, I asked, or is it educational? She made a sound that might have been a sigh. Just make sure you have every piece of documentation in order. If this goes public, and it will, you need to prove everything you did was by the book. That evening, I reached out to the local reporter who'd been covering HOA disputes in the area. I sent him a brief email about an interesting story developing Saturday. He responded within an hour saying he'd been following complaints about Lillian for months and would definitely be there. Wednesday morning, my phone started ringing. First call came from Robert Palmer, 3 houses down. Holden, I got your notice about the power shutdown. Is this because of what Lillian did to you? It's routine maintenance on infrastructure that happens to sit on my property, I said carefully. The timing is unfortunate, but the work needs to be done. But you own the substation. I own the land it sits on. My grandfather leased the property to the utility company in '95. The lease gives me certain rights, including requesting maintenance with proper notice. Silence. Then, does Lillian know you can do this? She's about to find out. Second call came from Margaret Torres, a retired teacher who'd lived here since the development opened. Mr. Brennan, I want you to know I don't support what Lillian did to you. Cutting your power and taking your generator was wrong. But this shutdown affects everyone, including people with medical equipment and young children. Is there any way to postpone until cooler weather? Her concern was genuine, and it made me pause. Mrs. Torres, I appreciate your kindness, but Lillian made the same calculation when she cut my power in 90-degree heat. The difference is I'm following proper legal procedures and giving everyone notice to prepare. She did it in the middle of the night as punishment. I understand, she said quietly. I just hope people remember who started this. Third call came from Vincent Murray. I've been fielding questions all morning. People are confused and angry. Most of them had no idea the substation was on private property. Lillian's been calling residents, telling them you're being vindictive. What are you telling them? The truth, that Lillian attacked you first, that you own the land, and that this shutdown is legal. Some people get it. Others think you're taking it too far. He paused. For what it's worth, I think your grandfather would approve. Sometimes you have to make a point loudly enough that people can't ignore it. Thursday afternoon, Lillian called. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. You think you're clever, she said without preamble, voice tight with barely controlled fury. This little stunt you're pulling Saturday won't work. The HOA has lawyers. We'll sue you for everything. I kept my voice level. Ms. Strickland, I'm conducting routine maintenance on private property. I've followed all legal requirements for notification and coordination with the utility company. If you have concerns, I suggest you direct them to your attorney. And while you're at it, you might ask about the criminal charges for theft and utility interference that are currently being investigated. She hung up without responding. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and allowed myself one moment of doubt. Tomorrow, elderly residents would sit in houses without air conditioning. Families with small children would scramble for alternatives. People with medical equipment might face genuine hardship. The human cost was real, and it weighed on me. But Lillian had made that same calculation when she cut my power, and she'd done it to punish me for asserting legal rights. What I was doing was different. It was measured, documented, done through proper channels with full legal authority. Sometimes the only way to stop abuse of power is to demonstrate who actually holds it. Friday evening, I received an email from Marcus at the utility company. Crew confirmed for tomorrow 8 a.m. all safety protocols in place. Documentation is excellent. Whatever's happening between you and your HOA, I'm glad we're not in the middle of it. I went to bed early, setting 3 alarms. Tomorrow was going to be a long day, and by the time it was over, everyone in Lakeside Meadows was going to understand exactly who held the real power. Saturday morning arrived hot and clear. I was awake by 6:30, showered and dressed in khakis and a button-down by 7. Professional but approachable, I needed to look like what I was, a reasonable person exercising legitimate property rights. The utility crew pulled up at 7:45. 3 trucks, 6 technicians in high-visibility vests, clipboards and equipment cases in hand. Marcus stepped out of the lead vehicle and shook my hand. We'll need you to sign off at each stage, he said. Standard protocol for private property maintenance. I nodded and followed them to the fenced area behind my house, where the substation hummed its familiar rhythm. By 8:15, a small crowd had gathered, residents in their driveways, coffee cups in hand, watching the utility trucks with confusion. Vincent stood near the edge of my property, arms crossed, a small smile on his weathered face. And then I saw the reporter, camera already recording, notebook open. He caught my eye and nodded. Marcus walked me through the procedure as his crew worked. First, verify all safety protocols, then isolate the circuits. Finally, throw the main disconnect. The whole process would take about 15 minutes. At 8:32 exactly, the lead technician looked at Marcus, who looked at me. "Ready, sir." I took a breath. The morning air was already thick with heat. Across the street, more residents were emerging from their houses, drawn by the unusual activity. I nodded. The technician pulled the main disconnect lever. The substation's hum died. 45 houses went dark and silent all at once. The change was immediate and visceral. Air conditioning units stopped mid-cycle. The ambient electronic hum that nobody notices until it's gone simply vanished. For a moment, the neighborhood was quieter than I'd ever heard it. Then voices started rising. Confusion first, then concern. People checking breaker boxes, calling neighbors, pulling out phones. The reporter approached, microphone ready. "Mr. Brennan, can you explain what's happening here?" I'd rehearsed this moment, but standing there with neighbors watching and cameras recording, the weight felt different. "I'm exercising my rights as property owner to conduct routine maintenance on the electrical substation located on my land. This infrastructure has served the community since 1995 under a lease agreement between my grandfather and the utility company. The shutdown was scheduled with appropriate notice and follows all legal protocols." "But why now?" he pressed. "Why on one of the hottest days of summer?" I met his eyes. "You should ask the HOA president that question. 6 days ago she had my power cut and my generator stolen in retaliation for asserting my property rights. Perhaps she can explain why she thought it was acceptable to leave one resident without electricity, but finds it unacceptable when the same situation affects everyone else." At the edge of the crowd, Lillian pushed through, face flushed, another board member trailing behind her. "This is outrageous," she shouted. "You can't cut power to the whole neighborhood just because you're angry." I faced her calmly. "I'm not angry, Miss Strickland. I'm conducting lawful maintenance on private property. Land your HOA has no authority over. Land that existed decades before your houses were built. Everyone here deserves to know who truly owns the infrastructure powering their homes." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Wait, you own the substation?" someone asked. "I own the land it sits on," I clarified, "which gives me certain legal rights, including requesting maintenance with proper notice." Vincent stepped forward. "That's right. I've been here since '82. His grandfather owned this property 30 years before the HOA existed. Lillian knew that when she cut his power and stole his generator. She retaliated against him for standing up for his rights, and now you're all seeing the consequences." A woman in a bathrobe spoke up. "Lillian, is it true you cut his power first?" Lillian's color faded slightly. "The HOA has authority under our charter." "Over your own property," Vincent interrupted. "Not his. You overstepped and everyone knows it now." Phones were recording. The reporter's camera was rolling. Lillian's authority was unraveling in real time. "We'll sue you for every cent," she said, voice shaking. I pulled out my phone. "Go ahead. I have the utility authorization, the lease proving ownership, the police report documenting your theft, and every certified notice. Everything here is legal and documented. Can you say the same?" She turned and stormed off, her board member trailing behind. Several residents watched her go with expressions ranging from anger to satisfaction. Marcus cleared his throat. We'll begin the inspection now, sir. I nodded, thank you. Facing the residents still gathered, I said, I know this is uncomfortable and I'm sorry for that, but I want everyone to understand something. Your HOA doesn't control your power. It runs on private property under lawful agreements that predate your homes. When leadership confuses authority with ownership, this is what happens. Maybe it's time to ask what kind of leadership you want. The reporter caught every word. By noon it would be online. By evening on the news. Margaret Torres approached me as the crowd began to disperse. Mr. Brennan, I understand why you did this, and I hope others will too once they've had time to think. I thanked her and went home to the house that still had no power, just like everyone else's now. I sent an email to all residents with comprehensive documentation, my deed, survey maps, the lease agreement, photos of the cut lock and stolen generator, the police report, and a timeline of events. Everything cross-referenced and time-stamped. Then I waited for 5 p.m., when the lights would return and the lesson would be clear. The utility crew finished at 4:53. Marcus found me on my back porch. Everything checked out, equipment's in excellent condition. We'll file our report with the county. He paused. For what it's worth, I've worked with a lot of HOAs. Most respect property rights. But every once in a while, you get someone who forgets that authority has limits. Sometimes they need a reminder. At 5 p.m. exactly, power returned to Lakeside Meadows. Across the neighborhood, air conditioning units hummed to life. Lights flickered on. Refrigerators resumed their familiar buzz. And 45 families finally understood who really controlled the infrastructure they'd taken for granted all along. Monday morning, the local paper ran the story on the front page. HOA president accused of illegal retaliation against resident. The reporter had done his homework. The article included quotes from my interview, photographs of the utility trucks and shutdown, excerpts from the police report about the stolen generator, and, most damaging of all, a timeline showing Lillian's violation notice, my documented response proving ownership, and her subsequent cutting of my power. The comment section online ran 3-1 in my favor. By noon, regional media outlets had picked up the story. Tuesday morning, a county inspector arrived. Inspector Caldwell from Building and Code Enforcement had questions about HOA violations and property rights. I invited him in and spent 2 hours walking him through documentation. He took copies of everything: my deed, survey maps, the lease agreement, violation notices, police report, photographs. You're not the first person to file complaints about this HOA, he said, taking notes in a leather binder. We've had 3 other residents contact us in the past 6 months. Unauthorized fines, threats of legal action, harassment over minor property modifications. But you have the most comprehensive documentation I've seen. After he left, Diana called with an update. The police found your generator in a storage unit rented by the board treasurer. He's claiming Lillian told him it was HOA property placed on common land without permission. Said he was following her orders. There was grim satisfaction in her voice. The problem is they documented the theft in writing. That letter claiming they'd removed your unauthorized generator, that's evidence of conspiracy. The district attorney's office is reviewing criminal charges. What about Lillian? She's lawyered up. Her attorney claims she acted in good faith based on her understanding of HOA authority. It's a weak defense given the pattern of complaints. That afternoon, the HOA called an emergency meeting, mandatory attendance for discussion of urgent community matters. I almost didn't go, but Vincent convinced me. People have questions, and you're the only one who can answer them. Besides, Lillian needs to see you're not hiding. The community center was packed at 7 p.m., every seat taken, residents standing along walls. Lillian sat at the front table with 3 other board members, all looking uncomfortable except her, who maintained rigid composure. When I walked in, conversation stopped. Eyes followed me to the back wall beside Vincent. Lillian called the meeting to order. We're here to address recent events that have caused disruption. There have been allegations made that are inaccurate and inflammatory. The HOA board has always operated in the best interests of all residents, enforcing standards that maintain property values. A woman in the third row raised her hand. Are you talking about the power shutdown? Because I got documentation that tells a different story. Another voice joined in. Yeah, I saw the police report online. You had his generator stolen. Lillian's jaw tightened. That was a misunderstanding. The generator was on what we believe to be common property. Vincent stood up. That's not what your letter said. You wrote that you were suspending his utilities as punishment for not paying your fine. That's retaliation. You did it after he proved the land was his. The room erupted. Lillian tried to regain control, but residents were demanding answers, demanding accounting of HOA funds, questioning other fines, calling for resignations. One of the other board members spoke up. Lillian, we need to address this. I've reviewed his documents. The deed is legitimate. We don't have authority over his land. We need to own this mistake. Lillian turned on him. We are not admitting wrongdoing. A resident in the front row stood. He gave us 48 hours notice. He followed legal procedures. He only did it after you cut his power first. You escalated this, Lillian. Maybe instead of blaming him, you should explain why you thought stealing his property was acceptable. The meeting devolved into chaos. Questions about financial transparency, demands for policy reform, calls for new leadership. By 8:30, a vote was called. 38 residents out of 40 present voted no confidence in Lillian and the current board. They were dissolved effective immediately, with a temporary committee formed including Vincent and 4 other longtime residents. Lillian stood, gathered her papers, and walked out without a word. I stayed another hour answering questions. Several residents apologized for not speaking up sooner about their own questionable fines. The pattern was clear: years of intimidation backed by authority that never existed. 2 weeks later, Lillian appeared at my door on a Thursday afternoon. I barely recognized her. The rigid posture was gone. She looked exhausted. "May I come in?" she asked quietly. I hesitated, then stepped aside. In my kitchen, I made tea. She wrapped both hands around the cup but didn't drink. "I came to apologize," she said finally. "I've been sitting in my house thinking about what I did, what I became. There's no excuse. I stole your property. I cut your power. I harassed you. I did it because the HOA was the only thing I had left after I retired. Somewhere along the way, I stopped leading and started controlling." Her hands trembled on the cup. "The county inspector showed me everything. Not just your documents, but complaints from 7 other residents. Fines I issued without proper authority. Threats that had no legal backing. I convinced myself I was protecting property values, but really I was just protecting my own sense of importance." She looked up. The shutdown, when I was standing there watching the power go out, watching all those people confused and angry, that's when I finally understood. You weren't being vindictive. You were showing everyone, including me, that authority doesn't mean power. I'd been wielding authority I never actually had. I sipped my tea. "Ms. Strickland, I didn't want to destroy your life. I wanted to stop you from destroying mine. You're apologizing to me, and I appreciate that. But there are other people in this neighborhood who deserve to hear this too." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I know. I've drafted a statement. I'm going to read it at the next community meeting. I'm going to apologize publicly and offer to refund every questionable fine from my own money." She paused. "I'm also facing criminal charges. The DA is offering a plea deal, probation, community service, restitution for your generator. But regardless of what happens legally, I needed you to know I understand what I did was wrong. Not just illegal, morally wrong." I accepted her apology but made something clear. I'm not going to advocate for leniency with the DA. What you did had consequences and those need to play out. But I'm also not pushing for maximum punishment. You're taking responsibility. That matters. The following Tuesday, Lillian read her statement at the community meeting. Her voice shook, but she didn't make excuses. She listed specific violations she'd issued improperly. She acknowledged the harassment, the intimidation, the misuse of authority. She apologized to me by name and to 6 other residents. She announced she was leaving Lakeside Meadows, not because anyone forced her, but because she needed a fresh start. The response was mixed. Some applauded, others sat in stony silence. Both reactions were valid. After she left, the new board presented proposed reforms: rotating presidency with 6-month term limits, monthly financial reports posted online, formal appeals process for violations, a residents' bill of rights protecting property owners from retaliation, and recognition that properties predating the HOA remained outside its jurisdiction. The vote was unanimous. 3 weeks later, Lillian moved out. I watched the moving truck from my kitchen window, feeling not satisfaction but resolution. 6 months later, autumn arrived with gentleness. I sat on my back porch with morning coffee, watching golden leaves drift across the lake. The house hummed with electricity. The substation buzzed its familiar rhythm in the background. The new HOA bore little resemblance to Lillian's regime. Monthly meetings drew 20 to 25 residents regularly. Decisions were discussed openly, voted on democratically, recorded transparently. Vincent served as rotating president. No violation notices had been issued in 6 months. Most people maintained their properties fine without threats. My morning routine had settled into something peaceful. Coffee on the porch, then a walk down the footpath to the shore. The same trail my grandfather walked, the same trail that started everything. Neighbors waved when they saw me now. Real friendliness, not nervous politeness. Small gestures that meant community was possible without control. One evening, Vincent and I sat on the dock fishing while the sun set. Not talking much, just enjoying the quiet. "You know what your grandfather told me once," Vincent said finally. "He said the best legacy isn't property or money. It's teaching people to stand up for themselves. You did that not just for yourself but for this whole neighborhood." I thought about the 7 residents who'd filed successful appeals, about the Community Emergency Fund now holding $48,000, about people finally understanding their rights. None of that was about me being special. It was about documentation, understanding systems, not accepting authority just because someone claimed to have it. That evening, I stood at my kitchen window watching the neighborhood glow with light. Every house warm against the darkening sky. All powered by infrastructure on my land. Infrastructure my grandfather agreed to host because he believed in helping his community. I defended that land not because I wanted to hurt anyone but because some principles matter. Property rights matter. Truth matters. Standing up to bullies matters. And teaching others to do the same matters most of all. The footpath shimmered in moonlight, worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Once blocked, now open again. Some things built on real foundations don't vanish. They wait to be remembered. This was home. It had always been home. Not because I'd won a fight, but because the neighborhood finally learned the same lesson my grandfather left me. Real power isn't about authority or control. It's about knowing and respecting what's truly yours. I finished my coffee and went inside, locking the door behind me. Tomorrow I'd walk the path again, and every day after.